Have you ever stopped to wonder how a mind actually gets built? I mean, we all start out as these tiny babies who can't even tell where they end and the world begins. And somehow we become adults who can think about things like philosophy and the universe. So, what is that journey? Well, today we are diving into the original blueprint for how we all learn to think. It's an incredible journey into the very architecture of the human mind. It really all boils down to this one big question, right? How do you get from a baby's world, which is just a jumble of blurry shapes and sounds and feelings, to a fully formed adult mind, capable of logic and abstract ideas? Well, the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget dedicated his entire life to mapping out that incredible transformation. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to meet the architect himself, Jean Piaget. Then we'll get into his core ideas, the mental blueprints we all use. From there, we'll walk through his 4 famous stages of development, from those very first thoughts to the rise of logic. And finally, we'll take a look at his lasting impact and why it all still matters today. Okay, so our guide for this whole exploration is Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss psychologist and a total pioneer. You should think of him less like a stuffy scientist and more like the very first cartographer of the mind, meticulously charting out the amazing territory of how we grow and think. Now, this right here was Piaget's big, revolutionary idea. See, before him, a lot of people just assumed that kids were basically miniature, less smart adults. Piaget came along and said, nope, not at all. He showed us that their minds operate on a completely different OS. He saw kids as these little scientists, constantly exploring, experimenting, and actively piecing together their own understanding of the world. So if we're building our own understanding, what tools are we using? Well, Piaget proposed a few core concepts that are like the mental toolkit we use to construct our reality. So let's open up the toolbox and check out the blueprints of our mind. The most basic building block is something he called a schema. Really, it's just a mental category or framework. You have a schema for dog, you have one for chair, you have one for love. They're kind of like the folders in your brain's filing cabinet, and they help you sort and make sense of the absolute flood of information that hits you every single day. So, how do we actually use these mental folders? This is where it gets really interesting. When we see something new, our brain does one of 2 things. First, there's assimilation. That's when we try to cram the new thing into a folder we already have. A toddler sees a zebra for the first time and yells, horse, because, it fits their 4-legged animal schema. But when that doesn't quite work, we use accommodation. A parent might say, no, that's a zebra, see the stripes? So the kid has to create a brand new folder just for zebras. This constant dance between fitting things in and creating new categories, that's the engine of learning. Piaget believed this whole learning process happens across 4 big, distinct stages. This is his master map of our cognitive growth. So, let's start the journey right at the beginning. Our journey begins in early childhood. These first 2 stages are where the absolute biggest foundational leaps are made. This is where we go from a world of pure sensation to the magic of symbolic thought. First up, we have the sensory motor stage. And just like the name says, babies in this phase are learning about the world entirely through their senses, touching, tasting, seeing, and through their actions, like grabbing and kicking and moving around. During this stage, something absolutely massive happens. They figure out object permanence. For a really young baby, if you hide their favorite toy under a blanket, it has literally ceased to exist. Poof, gone. Out of sight is truly out of mind. But as they get a little older, they realize the toy is still there, just hidden. So that simple game of peekaboo, for a baby, that's a mind-blowing lesson in the fundamental laws of physics. Okay, next up, we enter the pre-operational stage. This is where the magic really happens. Language and symbolic thought just explode. Suddenly, the world isn't just what you can touch and see, it's also what you can imagine and give a name to. Kids in this stage are amazing at pretend play. A broom can be a horse, a cardboard box can be a rocket ship. But their thinking is still really intuitive. It's not quite logical yet. And they run into this one big challenge: egocentrism. Now, this isn't about being selfish. It's a genuine inability to see the world from anyone else's point of view. It's why a little kid might try to comfort their sad mom by giving him their favorite stuffed animal. They just can't imagine she wouldn't be comforted by the same thing they are. Piaget's famous 3-mountain task shows this perfectly. You show a kid a model of some mountains, and you put a doll on the other side. Then you ask the child, what does the doll see? A kid in this stage will almost always describe what they see from their side. They can't mentally flip their perspective to see it from the doll's shoes. It's a brilliant little window into their unique way of thinking. All right, as kids get a bit older, their thinking goes through another massive upgrade. It gets way more organized, more systematic. We're now entering the rise of logic. Welcome to the concrete operational stage. This is a huge turning point. Logic finally arrives on the scene, but, and this is key, it's still tied to concrete, physical things that the child can actually see and touch and manipulate. The huge breakthrough here is the idea of conservation. Here's what that means. If you take a short, wide glass of water and pour it into a tall, skinny glass, a younger kid will say the tall glass has more water. But a kid in the concrete operational stage isn't fooled. They get it. They understand the amount is exactly the same because they can now perform a mental operation. They can imagine pouring the water back in their head and realize nothing was added or taken away. This is the start of real operational logic. And that brings us to Piaget's final stage, the formal operational stage. This is where thinking finally breaks free from the physical world and just launches into the stratosphere of the abstract and the possible. This is basically the operating system for the adult mind. We can now think about abstract concepts like justice or infinity. We can do that hypothetical what-if thinking, which is the foundation for both science experiments and, planning your future. This is the stage that lets us debate moral dilemmas and think about philosophical questions, grappling with big ideas that you can't just hold in your hand. So that's the whole journey, from basic senses to abstract thought. But what's the legacy of this incredible map of the mind? Let's step back and take a balanced look at Piaget's enormous impact. Honestly, it's impossible to overstate Piaget's influence. He completely flipped the script, changing our view of children from these passive little sponges to active builders of their own minds. His work has totally shaped modern education, encouraging hands-on, discovery-based learning. He basically gave us the first real comprehensive roadmap for how we learn to think. Of course, no theory is ever perfect. Science always moves forward. Later research suggests Piaget might have underestimated what kids can do at certain ages. Many psychologists today see development as more of a continuous, fluid wave than these rigid, separate stages. And they also point out the huge role that culture and our social lives play in shaping our minds, something Piaget didn't focus on quite as much. But even with those critiques, Piaget's theory is still a monumental achievement. He gave us the language and the framework to understand one of the most miraculous processes in the entire universe, how a thinking, reasoning mind comes to be. He showed us that we don't just receive our reality, we actively construct it. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What are you building with your mind today?